Okay, now let's do this together. So to handle the active state, I'm going to emulate it to copy the background color that we need. Then we'll need another CSS rule that targets the active state. Here, I'll set the background color to the one I copied. And we actually don't need to set the cursor to pointer here, because when we click on an element, our cursor is over the element, so we're in the hover state at the same time. So this should be enough. And when I reload the page, look at that. Now we're handling the active state as well. Good. Next, let's fix these ugly corners here. We don't have them in the normal state because in the normal state we have a default background color that is completely transparent or invisible. And because we have the padding from the left here and right here, which is also fully transparent because it inherits the default background color, we only see the round corners of the search container behind it. But when we hover over the search item or click on it, we're now setting its background color, and now it covers the corners and the shadow of the container. And actually, the content area ends where the round corners of the container end. It's just that by default, the browser doesn't hide the content that overflows, as you learned in the previous tutorials. This means that we can easily fix this by hiding whatever overflows the search container. To do this, we'll need to find the search results. Okay, there it is. The search results rule, which is our container for the entire search dropdown. And here we'll add another property, which will be overflow hidden. And this should hide any content that is outside of this element. And when I reload the page, now, if I hover over the search item or click on it, everything is fine. Because we asked the browser to hide anything inside the search results element that overflows, including this background that we're setting here. Now that we have taken care of the hover and active states, notice that when I click on the search item, or even when I hover over it, there is this white background behind the image, and it's a square. But if we look at the reference page, here it is a circle. So why is that, and how we can make it a circle on our page as well? Well, the reason is that this white background is only a part of the image itself, and we can make it a circle by rounding the corners of the image. And as you already know, we do this by using the border radius property. Now, this image is a square, and to make it a circle, we can just set its border radius to half of its width. Because if the radius is half of the width, the corners will bend so that they meet in the middle of each side, creating a perfect circle. And to do that, let's find the rule that targets our images. There it is. And we'll set the border radius property to half of its width, which is 8 pixels. And when I reload the page and hover over or click, great, now it's a perfect circle. Next, let's add this space between the image and the text, because we don't have it right now. Okay, how do we do this? Think about what CSS properties we already know that can help us with this. Okay, two that come to my mind are the padding and margin properties. Both can do what we want, but I think conceptually the margin property would be better here because it adds space outside of an element. And this space here is between the elements, so it's outside. So we could add the margin to the right side of the image or to the left side of the text, and that would be a good solution. But since their parent, so this li element, is also a flex container, we have a third option here. And probably you've already guessed what that is. We can use the gap property, which sets the distance between flex items. And so for more practice, let's use the gap property. We use the gap property on flex containers, and our list items are flex containers. Let me show you. Yes, they are flex containers. And so let's find the rule that targets our list items. There it is. This is the rule we're interested in, and I'm gonna write here gap. Let's start with, say, 10 pixels to see if it works, and then we'll get the correct value from the reference page. And if I reload the page, good. It works because there is this extra space, but notice that the gap property has added 10 pixels of space not only between these, but also between these two. This is because the gap property adds space between each flex item in the flex container. Most of the time you want this, but sometimes you want to add space between just some flex items, but not all of them. And in that case, use the margin property instead of the gap. But in our case, the gap property is perfectly fine. Now let's get the exact value for the gap, and let's hide this. So the gap value is 14 pixels, and I'm gonna update this, reload the page, perfect. Next, let's move this button to the right, just like we have it here. To do that, I want to show you a couple of tricks that professional developers use. And the first trick is to set the left margin of this button to automatically take up all the free space that's left after the text. And that left margin will push the button to the right. So let's do that. It's also important to make sure that we set the margin on the button element itself and not on its children, I mean not on this image. This is because the free space that the left margin will take up is inside the flex container, not inside the button itself. Because remember that flex items are the elements that are direct children of a flex container. But children of flex items like this image, they are not flex items. Okay, so to set the left margin of this button, let's go to VS Code and find the rule that targets the button. Probably we don't have that rule. So let's add one, and I'm going to copy this class name and search inside the file to make sure that we don't have the rule. Yeah. So let's add a new one, target the button. And here we'll write margin left auto. And this auto value tells the browser to assign to this margin all the unused horizontal space that is left inside the flex container. So watch what happens when I reload the page. And there you go. The button is right at the end of the flex container. And if I inspect the button, notice that this orange rectangle on the left, that's our left margin. It's taking up all the unused horizontal space. It almost reaches the edge of the text, and this extra empty space is actually the 14 pixels gap we set earlier. What's cool about this auto margin is that if we add more content in the elements to the left, so for example, if we make this image wider or increase the gap or add more text like say this, now see how the margin automatically adjusted and the button stays perfectly in the same place. This is a common way to position the last flex item on the right side of the flex container. Now let me show you another way to achieve this. First, we'll remove this auto margin and reload the page. And so the second way to push this button to the right is to make this element with the text take up all the space available. And just like with the auto left margin, this will push the remove button to the right. From previous tutorials, we know that we use the flex grow property on a flex item to add all the available space to it. And that we only use the flex grow property on flex items, not the flex container itself. And that by default, the value of the flex grow property is 0, and if we set it to 1, the flex item will get all the available space. And so this is what we're going to do. To push the remove button to the right, we want to grow the search value div. I mean this one. I don't think that we have a CSS rule that targets this div yet, but to be sure, let's copy the class name and search in our style sheet. Okay, we don't have the rule. And to search in this file, I use the command F keyboard shortcut for Mac, or it's Control F for Windows. And another way is to go inside the edit menu, and there is this find option here. But I encourage you to learn this shortcut because you're going to be searching things a lot and it's going to save you a lot of time over the years. Okay, and now let's add a new rule that targets the search value. And here we want to set the flex grow property to 1, and that should give the element all the available space. And if I reload the page, there you go. Now the remove button is at the end of the flex container. So the same result as with the margin left auto. Okay, and so how do you know when to use the margin left auto approach and when to use the flex grow approach? In our case, both approaches are fine, and you want to use the auto left margin approach when you want to push the last flex item to the right and keep the natural width of the remaining flex items intact. For example, if I search for MDN and open their website, in navigation menus like this, if you want to keep the natural size of your menu items, but also push the rest to the right, like this theme button, you want to use the auto margin approach here, because you don't want your navigation items grow. And so this is how it looks like when the auto margin is used to push the rest of the items to the right. The tools item here has its natural size and it looks good. And this is how it looks like when the flex grow 1 is used here instead of the auto margin. Notice how the tools item is stretched horizontally and it just looks wrong. So if you want to keep the natural size of your elements, use the margin auto approach. But for the cases where you want to grow your flex items, use the flex grow approach. Okay, next let's handle the hover and active states for the button like here. So when we hover over the button, the cursor should become a pointer and a gray circle should appear behind the image. And when we click the button, the circle should change color. So how do we make this gray circle? Well, we can set the background color of the button. And to make it a circle, we can set its border radius property to half of the width, as we did with the community image here. And to make the button background bigger than the image, we already know that we can use padding. So let's do all this. First, we need to find out the value of the background color here. And as usual, I'm going to inspect the element and then emulate the hover state to enable the hover rule. And don't worry that the dropdown disappeared in this case. The rules are still visible here. Let me increase this. There you go. There is the rule. I'll copy this color, and inside our VS Code, we already have this empty CSS rule that targets our button. So let's use this rule. I'm going to write background color, then paste the color, and let's also change it to target the hover state. Let's also change the cursor to a pointer. And if I reload our page, an ugly gray rectangle appears on hover. And if I inspect the button, you can see that it gets this default padding, and this is why the background is slightly bigger than the image. And let's disable this flex debug information because we don't need it right now. Okay, so let's change the padding to be the same from all sides to make it a perfect square. I'm not going to guess the padding value because we can just use the DevTools to get it from the reference page. And I'm going to inspect this button. The padding is 8 pixels from all sides. And this is what we're going to set here, padding 8 pixels, reload our page. And now the button jumps back and forth on hover because the padding changes from the default in the normal state to the larger one in the hover state. And to avoid this, we can add another CSS rule that targets the normal state of this button and move the padding property to the rule so that it will be applied in all states. And for that, I'm going to copy this and add one more rule just before the hover rule. And this is where we're going to move the padding property. And now this works properly. Next, let's change this square to a circle. For that, we'll need to set the border radius property to half the width. And because we're using padding property here to calculate half the width, we have to add the padding to the width and then divide it by 2, which is a bit tedious. There is a better way. We can set the value. So we can write border radius and set the value here to be 50%, which in this case means to use half the width. And now if I reload the page, we've got almost a perfect gray circle. Okay, so what's going on here and how can we fix it? Now the reason is that this button is not a perfect circle, is in this image. Now if you look at the image itself, it looks like it's just a perfect square, so it's 16 by 16. And because the button has the same padding from all sides, this should be a perfect circle, but it's not. So again, look at the content area of the image. It's just a perfect square. But if we look at the content area of the button, which is this blue area, notice that it's not the same as the image. It is a bit taller. And this is why our button is not a perfect circle. Now we've got this extra space in the content area inside the button because images are by default inline elements in CSS. Or simply put, CSS treats images sort of like regular text, and by default, CSS elevates images a bit to handle certain text characters well. And to fix this, we can apply a special property to our image. So for that, let's target the image. To apply that property, first we need to add a CSS rule that will target the image. And notice that this image doesn't have a class, so let's use a combination of selectors to target it. For that, I'm going to copy this class name from its parent, which is this button. And then in our CSS code, we'll add another rule. And we can just write img here, so use a tag selector with this space, which here is a descendant combinator that allows us to target all the image elements inside this class, no matter how deep they are nested within. Or we can use the direct child combinator, and you already know how this works. So both combinators will be fine in this case. Okay, and so this targets our image. And now to fix it, let's write vertical align bottom. Now this will remove that little elevation from our image. And if I reload the page, there you go. Now the button is a perfect circle. I won't explain the vertical align property here in detail because I think there are much more important things to learn at the beginning. And there is one more thing, almost 100% of the time, we don't want this elevation behavior with our images by default. Because notice, for example, when I switch tabs back and forth with the reference page, you can see that the Reddit logo on our page is slightly elevated as well. So I suggest that we fix this elevation behavior for all images on our page. And for that, what we can do is we can simply remove this part. And now this CSS rule is applied to all images on our page. And if I reload our page, notice that this button stays a perfect circle, but also this image is now aligned with the image on the reference page. And lastly, because this rule affects all the images on our page, So it's not just search related. I suggest that we move this rule into this style sheet that we created for the cases just like this one. And if I reload our page, everything should stay the same. Great. Next, notice this black border around the button. The browser adds this black border to buttons by default when we change their styles. We don't want this border here because there is no border on the reference page around these buttons. So I'm going to ask you to pause this video and remove this border because you already know how to do this. Okay, and let me quickly remove the border as well. So for that, I'm going to write border and the value will be none. And there you go. Next, let's deal with the active state. That is when we click on the button. And in the active state, we want to change the button's background color. So for that, let's emulate the active state and copy the color from here. This is a very transparent black color. Let's add another CSS rule, recent search remove, that targets the active state of these buttons. And here we want to set the background color property to this one. Reload the page and there you go. Now the button changes its background color on click. And actually, congratulations, we're done writing styles for the search items. Now we just need to add the HTML code for the rest, for these ones, for the rest of the search items from here. Let me resize the developer tools to see the dropdown better. So to add the remaining search items, we'll need to save each of these community icons and duplicate the first search item HTML 4 times. Then change the path to the community image for each of them and their search text. So pause this video and do that yourself. I mean, add these remaining search items. And I'm going to speed up the video because there is nothing new here. Normally, you don't have to do this repetitive work manually because you have a programming language that does all this work. You'll learn about it in future courses when we get to JavaScript and other programming languages. And when I reload the page, there they are, the remaining search items. Well done. And this is it for this video. And in the next video, we're going to create the trending today section or component. And I'm going to add the link here when it's ready.